Hello, thank you for stopping by. My name is Richard Pepper. The title of this stream, Do Afrikaners Have a Right to Their Own Universities, was a thought that came to me when I saw a BBC video where a black or mixed race young woman, attractive young woman, obviously intelligent, was being interviewed by a BBC reporter. I think it was BBC. But the issue that she discussed is the kind of issue that we see discussed in the United States. Why are black people unhappy with what they've been confronted with in terms of economic and educational possibilities and opportunities? Apparently, this is a major question in South Africa, where you have a number of mixed race or black students attending African universities where they speak Afrikaans. And this mixed race or this black young woman touched on the kind of points that you would see touched on in America. Black people make up whatever it is, 80+% of the country, maybe 90% of the country. 5 million whites, 50 million blacks. I'm not sure what the divide between African whites and English-speaking whites, but it's a fairly small minority when you put it in the context of 60 million people. However, what we see in South Africa is, I suppose, inevitable once you have a democracy and ethnic interests at odds with a very small white population and a very large black population. If you've seen any other of my videos or read any of my blogs on War by IQ, I take the point that the first entry into economic development is behavior. And that is the way I look at this issue here. African universities were founded by African-speaking people for a purpose: to support and advance the interests of young Afrikaners, African young men and women. You don't see that in the discussion in the BBC report. You see that there's a problem because black young people are unhappy. But black young people didn't produce the university. The university represents money, stress, effort, capital, intelligence, put in for generations by Africans, African-speaking Africans, white people. Now, the black woman has a reasonable reasonable problem that she would like to have us sympathize with her about. And the problem is, she speaks English or her own black dialect, or black language, excuse me. She can't understand Afrikaans. Or in this particular instance, I gather that's the general rule that black people do not understand, black young people do not understand Afrikaans. That they do understand English and they want to prepare themselves for the larger world, where, of course, English is the absolute requirement of a modern technical world. You've got to speak English. To me, it reminds me of the times that I listen to people in Canada speak about the United States, it's impossible to miss the tremendous effect that the American culture has around the world. Some of these Canadian YouTubers know more about American politics than I do, and I've lived here all my life. Similarly, the language this black young woman used to indicate her protest to the African-speaking university was the same kind of vocabulary that you would hear in the United States. White privilege. We should be democratic. A minority should not have the right to dictate to a majority. But that's one thing to say in the United States, where there are 200 million whites and a $20 trillion economy. It's a very different approach in Africa, where you've got a handful of whites trying to support their civilization, their economic course, their economic advancement, while being surrounded by mostly poor, somewhat illiterate, and less advanced black people. What are white Afrikaners supposed to do? Are they supposed to give up their language? Now, Joshua Jesus says, great show. No, they don't. I don't know. I take it that he is responding to the title of the stream. Do Africans have a right to speak to their own university, in effect? Well, what you're saying is that the people that built the university, that paid for the university, that created the university, are going to have to give it up and walk away. The Rainbow Nation we see means one color of the rainbow, namely the white color, has to be completely obliterated in terms of what they can do to affect their interests. I think the young woman used the word white privilege. I know I've been struck when I watch YouTube presentations from South Africa, that how often they use terminology that we use in the United States. I assume that basically they picked it up from American broadcasters or American YouTubers or American newspapers or American books, because this is the kind of imprint, the kind of footprint America has across the planet. That the social justice warriors have taken the American muscle, if you will, the American ability to drive certain themes across the planet and taken them for their own purposes. White privilege means something in the United States when you have a massive white population, as they say, over 200 million European descendants. But to say that we're going to use the same kind of vocabulary and the same analysis on a situation in South Africa, where you've got a few million Africans who've done heroic things in the teeth of very, very difficult surroundings, and now you're going to tell the Africans, no, you don't have a right to their university. You don't have a right to use your language in the university that you built for your progeny. It seems extreme to me. But it seems, I realize that this cuts against the grain, where we have listened so often to people who have a bias towards letting the majority have its way, which, of course, we all want. This is inherent in a democracy, that the majority should have their own way. Excuse me. Just water. But it seems unreasonable when you've got 2 million people, 3 million people, 4 million people, whatever the Afrikaner representation in South Africa is, creating. They're creating this university, and now you're saying, oh, incidentally, you have to walk away from putting your culture on your creation. Now, this black woman, she says, well, it doesn't work. It doesn't work for us. It doesn't work for the non-African speaking. What she describes is from an economics course, that what happens is you've got people who can speak both Afrikaans and English, and the professor will make a statement in Afrikaans, and then the interpreter, if you will try to process it, and interpret it, and say it in English for the rest of the non-speaking African attendees. And of course, a lot of these people that are doing the interpretation do not really understand the subject matter. That was the point of her basic objection, as I understood it. That you've got people who don't understand economics interpreting economics text. And I suppose that's, understandable. You can't have, obviously, expert economics people and plus expert interpreters working to interpret a course for whatever it might be, 12 or 15 or 25, whatever, members of an introductory class in South Africa. I suppose the answer that I would prefer would be that Afrikaners should be able to have some measure of autonomy in the development of their institutions and making use of the institutions that they have developed, which means even though they are not the majority of the population, if they created the institution, they should be able to basically pilot, if you will, where the institution goes, what happens to it. The reverse of that is to say that they have to bow to the majority in each instance, which means in effect that blacks get to vote on what whites can do with what whites created. There's that reason. There's an echo here of the debate that's now unfolding in the United States on the issue of black reparations for blacks. Excuse me. You hear some crazy, whacked out, off the wall assertions that blacks, quote, created the United States. Well, that's absurd. Of course they did. They engaged in a very low level, agriculturally based process for hundreds of years, to be sure, but they didn't create the wealth of the United States. The North was always richer than the South. It's clear that the impulse, that the driving force has come from industrialization. That's come from the North, not from the agricultural South. As you may have known, have heard, if you've heard me before, I've said that when Richard Spencer says that the central lie of American economic experience is that whites have gained from the presence of others in economic sense, I would say he is making an extreme statement that I don't really agree with, but I would point it this way, that to me, the central mistake, the central miss of the analysis that's going on in the United States is that people are unwilling to tell black people, or blacks are unwilling to tell themselves how much they have gained because they have access to white engineers and what white engineers can produce. And I've seen it over my lifetime, and I hope that process continues, and I assume it will if we retain the semblance, at least, of a competitive economy that's driven by market forces, private property rights, and competition. Those are the great hallmarks, I think, of a free and developing economy. And I think the same thing is going to be true in Africa. The same thing is going to be true in Russia. The same thing is going to be true in China. People don't realize that China and Russia have moved away from the kind of iron grip socialism that defined both China and Russia in mid-century of the 20th century, because that kind of socialism does not work. Competition works, free markets work, property rights work. And the Afrikaners, the African-speaking people, the Boers, have done a lot for South Africa, and so they've done a lot for black people. I mean, in a way, I've thought before when I've been watching some of these videos by South African, particularly South African blacks, that in a way, apartheid has become analogized to slavery in the United States. That any problem that blacks have in the United States can be tracked according to the prevailing ethos in the United States, to the fact that blacks were slaves. Well, this is one thing, again, to promulgate in the United States when you've got a very large population of whites in a $20 trillion economy. Promulgating the same thing in Africa, in South Africa, where you've got a few million whites, tens of millions more of blacks, in by American standards, a very poor economy. I don't know what's to be done either, but I think that people have to start to speak out and start to speak some kind of common sense and say, look, Africans built part of big gobs of the structure that black Africans now want to move into. Let's not kill the goose that laid the golden egg. Thank you for watching. I would appreciate it if you'd click the like and the share buttons. Thank you.